you, everyone. I joined the Conservative movement in a very unusual way. I didn't study politics or government at university. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an engineer. Thank you. I am an engineer. I analyze systems. I like to know how things work, and I love to fix things that are broken. I'm a child of the 80s. I was born in London, but I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you, Roxy. Lagos was a place where almost everything seemed broken. I grew up under a military dictatorship, and I would never have believed that 40 years later, I would be standing here as the leader of the world's most successful political party in the history of Western democracy. And yet, I am here as leader now because my party suffered its greatest ever election defeat. We lost 2/3 of our members of parliament and polled at a historic low. I'm here to talk about why that happened and why it matters for all of you. I believe my party lost because it spent a lot of time talking right but governing left. We didn't recognize how the world was changing. And when we did not adapt enough. There was complacency about the nature of the enemy we were fighting because a lot of people did not recognize it. They didn't recognize it for what it was. There is a great movie from the 1990s. I'm sure many of you have seen it. It's called The Usual Suspects. And in it, there is a fantastic quote that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he did not exist. That is the trick that our opponents on the left, whatever you want to call them, communists, socialists, in this country they call them liberals. I don't know why, there's nothing liberal about them. But there is a trick that they play, which is that they smuggle ideas and policies that look like liberalism, but are anything but. Liberalism has been hacked. Let me give you an example. The UK, like many countries, has generous laws to accommodate persecuted people who are seeking asylum. It was reported this year that 1 in 7 asylum seekers who were housed on a barge in southern England were converting to Christianity under the supervision of local church leaders. So I'm not religious myself, but I am and always will be the granddaughter of a Methodist reverend. And I know the joy that comes to priests every time their flocks grow and a sinner repenteth. But I found it shocking that not a single one of these conversions was treated with any suspicion until at the same time it was discovered that one convert was found to have committed multiple sexual offenses after arriving in the UK and then went on to carry out a chemical attack on a mother and her 2 young children. And it turned out that over many years, we have had very naive church leaders converting people who had no interest in Christianity as a means to circumvent border control. This is what I mean when I say that liberalism has been hacked. When a system that makes accommodations for the vulnerable is being exploited by opponents of that system, something needs to change. These aren't features of the system. They are bugs, and they need fixing. If conservatives and liberals try to manage migration with simplistic tests and no overall vision of what kind of country we are trying to create, we will fail, and the voters will punish us, as my party found out in July. There are many, many ways that liberalism is being hacked, both socially and economically. In January this year, Javier Milei gave a fantastic speech in Davos, of all places. But I must quote it, because it had very similar themes to a speech that I gave 2 years ago, which I'm hoping actually inspired him. And in his speech, he says, "It may sound ridiculous to suggest that the West has turned to socialism, but it's only ridiculous if you limit yourself to the traditional economic definition of socialism, which says that it's an economic system where the state owns the means of production. This definition should be updated in the light of current circumstances." And he goes on to say that today states don't need to control the means of production to control every aspect of the lives of individuals. With tools such as printing money, debt, subsidies, controlling the interest rate, price controls, and regulations to correct market failures, the state can control the lives and fates of millions of individuals. He is absolutely right. 2 years ago, when I gave that speech about how so many leftist ideologies have snuck into institutions across the Western world wearing the clothes of the civil rights movement, but they are not about civil rights. So many people don't know what freedom really is because they've always had it. They have no idea just how lucky they are and just how fragile freedom can be. They don't know how easily freedom can be taken away, or in some cases, given away. I was lucky in my experiences. I was born to a relatively wealthy family and had a decent education. But I also know what it is like to be poor. I watched my family become poor as their wealth, income, and savings were inflated away by destructive government policies. But they didn't call it socialism, but it definitely was. Capital controls, no freedom of movement, government owning the means of production. And there was no freedom either. The government decided which school your child went to, it decided which businesses could or could not operate, all the way to arrests with no trial and state-sanctioned murder. So I know what freedom looks like. It's what I had in the UK. I know the values that can make citizens wealthier and happier, and how without them, they become engines of misery and despair. Classic liberal values, not left-wing liberalism, but classic liberalism of free markets, free speech, free enterprise, freedom of religion, the presumption of innocence and trusted institutions within the rule of law, and equality under the law, no matter who you are or where you come from. All of those things were missing when I was growing up as a child. So I know their value, and I know that in the West, we may be losing what made our countries great. All of us here are custodians of a great tradition, a tradition that is under threat. We all have something in common. Whether you identify as a conservative or as a classic liberal, all of us on the center-right share these values, and we are dealing with the same problem, and that is that those values have been hacked, they have been undermined. But if we can spot the trick, we can stop it from destroying our societies. We are giving away freedoms away by stealth because we don't know that value, and we are not adapting. Ideologies and beliefs that demand our tolerance, even as they seek to undermine the very culture and institutions that create that tolerance. It is the question all of us in politics today must answer. How do liberal democracies, which are so tolerant and so accepting, fight against the intolerance of those it has accepted, of different norms, customs, and values which are accommodated within the liberal framework, but which seek to undermine it at every level? I started my speech by explaining that I joined the conservative movement in an unusual way. It started when I moved back to the UK from Nigeria, age 16. My parents were doctors. They wanted me to be doctors just like them. So I got to London and got a job at McDonald's. And then I started off part-time at a local college where I told them what my ambitions were. And it was the first time in my entire life that a teacher told me, a straight-A student, that my ambitions were too high. She asked me if I was sure I wanted to be a doctor. It would be much easier if I became a nurse. And I realize now that she was trying to be helpful. In her own misguided way, she thought that black kids were not very academic. She wanted me to aim low and succeed rather than aim high and fail. And you all know that if a teacher tells a 16-year-old their grades aren't that important, they won't work as hard. I didn't know how to describe what was happening at the time, but I knew I didn't like it. Today, I call it the bigotry of low expectations. It does not believe in meritocracy, and it seeded in me a hatred of affirmative action policies that are designed, in theory, to help minorities, but in reality hold them back and cast doubt on their real achievements. The truth is that the left are not that interested in ethnic minorities, except as a tool to fight their battles against the right. In fact, just this morning, the British Prime Minister, the Labour Prime Minister, made a joke about how I worked at McDonald's. He would never have dared to do that if I was a left-wing activist. And if a Conservative Prime Minister had made those comments about a black party leader, they would have been called a racist and asked to resign. Even as a teenager, I could see the hypocrisy in so much of their rhetoric. I knew that these were not my kind of people, and so I started taking an interest in conservatism and happened upon the books of Thomas Sowell, and the rest, as they say, is history. Growing up in a place where everyone looked like me inoculated me against the fashionable and nonsensical notion of white privilege, or that oppression was primarily related to skin color. Oppression narratives are the new cloak for socialism to smuggle itself into institutions, pretending to be civil rights, pretending to be social justice. These are the new battle lines, and I'm here to tell you how to fight them. In the UK, I'm criticized as a culture warrior. It is meant to be pejorative, but I love the title the left-wing media give me. My grandfather told me that I was descended from warriors, and so I think I'm keeping up with tradition. I believe in tradition, and if we don't defend our culture, who will? So how does liberalism get hacked, and how do we fight it? Let's start with an example. We all believe in freedom. None of us want our country to be invaded, so of course we are against imperialism. Suddenly, a group turns up. They want to promote anti-imperialism. It sounds okay. The government gives them money, they get university grants, they write textbooks, and they bring those narratives into the school curriculum. And suddenly you find that anti-imperialism is directed solely against our own country, or the West. They're not attacking China. They're not attacking Russia. In fact, in some instances, they praise Russia, which is actively carrying out an imperialist agenda against Ukraine. Here's another example, the anti-racism movement. We are all against racism. So a group turns up and says that they are anti-racist. It sounds okay. And then all of a sudden, we see that they've decided that all white people are racist. And so the only way to be anti-racist is to be against white people because of their white privilege. This is nonsense. And it happens over and over and over again. We all care about our environment. We are conservatives. Conservative parties, by their very nature, are almost rooted in rural communities, the original parties of the land, dedicated to leaving a better world for our children. And for many years, Conservatives happily worked with all parties to protect the natural world, to repair it where needed, to make it more beautiful, and to tread carefully in how we used its riches. Yet, just as in so many policy areas, these values were hacked, replaced by a radical green absolutism. Looking after our planet became an exclusive discussion about net zero and reducing emissions, and alongside it, the growth of activist governments to regulate it. Even feminism, that was meant to promote the rights of women, has spent so much time diving into postmodernism and deconstructing the dialectic, it doesn't know what a woman is anymore. But harm is caused. That movement doesn't know what a woman is to the extent that in Scotland they were putting rapists in women's prisons simply because the men declared themselves women. This is how liberalism gets hacked. We talk about free speech, and then our enemies use it to feed self-loathing propaganda to our children on social media. We talk about freedom of religion, only to see those that do not want freedom use their religion and use their rights to take away the freedoms of others, as we saw just last week in the UK Parliament when a Labour MP effectively demanded blasphemy laws. The presumption of innocence is thrown away and replaced with cancel culture, masquerading as justice. The right to protest is used as a cover to carry out intimidation, most recently, as we've seen in cities across the world, of Jews. Posters of missing children and kidnapped hostages are ripped down denying the freedom of others to be heard. Our history, read through the most hostile and negative interpretations, taught to children and widely propagated on our own media. These problems are not just national, they are international. The European Convention of Human Rights is now interpreted well beyond the intentions of its creators, to a point where nations can no longer arbitrate fairly between citizens. Motions at the UN that would never pass now do so regularly because of the moral cowardice of those who should know better. We turn up at international conferences, and other countries are demanding reparations to the tune of trillions of dollars for historical injustices, as we saw at the Commonwealth Conference earlier this year. Every country in the world can claim that it deserves reparations from another one. This is not serious foreign policy. And I remember when talks of reparations were a fringe discussion, but the movements are springing up and they will become mainstream because their proponents sense a weakness in the West and in those who are meant to defend and champion Western values. I don't like using the word woke to describe these issues. I use progressive authoritarianism because the word woke masks just how deeply destructive these ideologies are. But for some reason, progressive authoritarianism is not catching on. I don't know why. So how do we fix this? We need muscular liberalism and muscular conservatism. We don't want to throw away any of the things that are good about our society, but we need to police the boundaries, otherwise our opponents will blur them to the point where they no longer exist. And the first step is to explain the value of liberty. Our opponents have no fundamental concept of the meaning of liberty. They see it as freedom to do bad things. Whether they are offensive or exploitative, that's all they think about. Liberty is a practical necessity for a flourishing society. It is not just a philosophical nice to have. The second thing we have to do is to stop the expansion of the state. A common mistake is to accept that every problem requires the state to get involved, and this reinforces that belief that state action can solve everything when it cannot. The more state power grows, the more we curtail what people can and should do for themselves. Worse, we reduce people's ability to think for themselves. And this is why I'm so excited about DOGE and what President-elect Trump and Elon Musk will do on government efficiency. It is terrifying people all around the world, but I think that it's going to be absolutely brilliant. The Conservative Party forgot what the state's purpose is in national life. No longer asking what it should or should not do, the state expanded and taxes went up. Instead, we use state power to continue tinkering with every aspect of life in order to achieve social justice. And if we keep doing that, we will sleepwalk into a planned economy far more oppressive than thinkers in the 20th century could ever have thought. The third thing we have to do is to stop being afraid to defend our beliefs. Let's stop being shamed into staying quiet. Part of the problem is that for the center-right, liberty has come to mean laissez-faire, that we should sit back and do nothing. We are told we must not take sides, not fight culture wars, that this is the operation of a free society, that this is progress. This is not progress. This do-nothing attitude is deeply misguided. Freedom must be protected and nurtured with reference to broader principles. Thank you. People should always be treated as individuals. Due process must always be ensured, and a limited state should operate in a neutral fashion to everyone in society, and the rule of law must be protected under which all are equal. We cannot reverse time, but we can build a new future, and this requires a philosophy that is strong and confident in itself, and not overly fixated on the past. I'm not talking too much about the past today. I want to talk about the future, because we have to make a case for what we are for, not just what we are against, and not just about how things used to be. If we talk about what we are against all the time, we create new opponents, but very few, if any, new allies. A positive alternative is needed, not just harking back to nostalgia. And this project also requires the case to be made for that leaner government that stops the unnecessary growth of the state I just described, and that growth of the state is what has been creating those multiple opportunities for activists to spread left-wing ideology. But too much rhetoric speaks of a smaller state as an end in itself. It is more than that. A smaller state is a means to secure a better way of doing things, allowing bureaucracy to focus and prioritize its resources. The best governments do a few things well and not many things badly. So in conclusion, we can look at what is happening around the world. Arguments over pronouns and gender-neutral toilets or statues and white privilege may seem trivial when compared to solving climate change and the demographic time bomb of an aging population. But they are linked. You can't ask the rest of the world to make sacrifices to achieve net zero if you've just told them that Western civilization prospered by exploitation. Why should they trust you? Why should they trust you on anything from technology to vaccines and public health? If the West is only prosperous due to slavery and colonialism, if all of its success is down to the patriarchy and white supremacy and heteronormative oppression, there is a price to be paid. And that price is that our beliefs, democracy, equality before the law, meritocracy, free markets, are fiction. Fairy tales we tell ourselves to cover up a dark and murky past. There can be no resolution of the big problems of our age if we lose confidence in our history and the story of Western civilization. And if we fail to defend it, there are many competitor states who will happily watch as we undermine ourselves before they take over. So as I conclude, I apologize for ending on a morbid note, but I want to share a personal story of what happens when we don't defend the things we believe in, when we fail to give hope to the young. A vacuum is created, and other beliefs fill this vacuum. 2 years ago, this month, almost to the day, my cousin, who was living in Canada, killed himself. He was 27 years old, and he had fallen down the social media and internet rabbit hole of anti-natalism and pro-mortalism, left-wing movements I'd never even heard of. He had spent months, we found out, probably years, reading and self-radicalizing, learning about how human beings were a plague on the world, that our very existence was destroying the planet. These movements promoted the idea that having children was wrong, evil even, that ending your life was a better way to stop the spread of misery around the world. And it was heartbreaking to know that these ideas had filled his mind and tortured him. He is, or was, one of a generation of young people that see nothing ahead of them but a bleak future and no hope. I worry that when we do not promote what we believe, when we don't talk about it enough, things that matter, things that make life worth living, the importance of family, personal responsibility, how our beliefs and how our ideas are a force for good around the world, we fail to offer hope to the next generation. It is our job to provide hope. There is no cavalry coming, it is just us. We have a job to do in championing and defending values that don't just help to win elections, but make the world a better place. Thank you.
For more on well-researched and balanced stories, events, and interviews across business, tech innovation, and lifestyle, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel, www.youtube.com/digivationnetwork.